choice will be Friday morning. That said, are there any questions? Now is the time, or is a time. I will have office hours tomorrow. It would be good. What's a good time? 1? Okay, from 1 to 3. I'll just be sitting there, hoping that you show up and ask questions. Yeah.
So minor question. The method of submission is a document envelope, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so would it be better to just put them all in one document?
One document, please. Do not make me go collating several documents. Just
okay, so that
one
the
document.
citation for the book, you just have it in one, and then it applies for all document, right?
Yes, and you don't even need to have a bibliography. You could just put like Dimmock, page blah, column blah. That's where you got a quotation from. Okay? Yeah, but do please provide an independent word count for each of your 3 submitted essays. Okay? Yeah.
Would you prefer a PDF or a Word?
I'm going to say Word, but just not some weird other thing. Okay, Word or PDF, but and Word by preference. Yes, Christopher, your question would be?
On question 4, can you hear me?
Yes. I
Okay.
can hear almost nothing else.
Okay. On question 4 about Hart, when you ask, do you find it compelling, why or why not? Are you referring to Hart's account of legal obligation or his theory of law in general?
It's theory of legal obligation.
Okay, thank you.
The it.
I also have another question, actually.
Let's hear it.
When writing, some of, like on question, I think it was 2 in specific, I answered like in terms of for each question you ask, I have like a paragraph answering that one thing. Would you prefer that over like a paragraph where I have all of the answers and like yeah, I kind of have to find it?
I don't have a general answer to a question like that, but I will tell a story. When I was in law school, my first year of law school, I had a class on torts, you know, torts being that area of the civil law in which people seek redress for harms. And the professor was a typical super charismatic, you know, dude. And we asked, or someone in the class asked on the last day of class for the exam if he had any advice for the exam. What he said was, write well. So that's my advice to you about how to do your paragraph structure, etc. Not very helpful, but exactly the correct advice. Any other questions, substantive or otherwise? I'm hoping that the paucity of questions is not a function of the fact that you haven't been thinking about this stuff. Yeah. Okay.
I've had teachers like not grade my work before.
I don't bloody care. Something I can read. Not not symbol. Not you know. No, I don't care. No, Eric. Definitely not to your question. Should each essay have the usual introduction, body paragraphs, and conclusion? No, I do not want introductory paragraphs. I do not want concluding paragraphs. I just want you to answer the questions. Okay, introductions tell you what you're going to say or what you're going to talk about. I know what you're going to talk about because it's what I told you to talk about. Conclusions summarize what you just said. But I know what you just said because I just read it. So concluding and introductory paragraphs are basically a waste of time in an exercise like this. Okay, think of them more as responses to the questions than what your 9th grade composition teacher told you about essays. Okay, I do not want to read any pointless sentences like, you know, the nature of law has been a topic of conversation among philosophers for millennia. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear that. Just answer the bloody questions. That is the spirit. You're right. Full of spirit. Oh, maybe you people in here want to see the. Oh, there you go. Anything else? Now's your chance. Or from 1 to 3 tomorrow. I hope I don't have an impromptu meeting that gets scheduled then. You are my first priority. Nothing. Oh, you must have some pretty solid understanding. Okay. Let's then go back to the separation thesis. Try to remember where we were. The penumbra. Problem of the penumbra. Okay. So, according to Hart, typically, so remember what we're talking about here is the separation thesis, the thesis that there's a difference between the law as it is and the law as it should be. Okay? And some people have argued, and Fuller doesn't exactly argue this, but it has been argued that once you realize that there are areas in which the law is not clear whether a law applies to a given case or not, then you'll realize that in those areas, judges have to, right? They have to decide, and they therefore will appeal to how the law should be. So at least in those cases, right, there's a direct connection between how the law is, that is what decisions are made in the interpretation of cases, of hard cases, unclear cases, and how it ought to be. So there's a natural connection, an essential connection between law as it is and law as it should be, or it ought to be. And that looks like a challenge to the separation thesis. So Hart, who believes in this idea that there is a penumbra in which a rule it's unclear whether it applies, but he wants to say that does not indicate what opponents of the separation thesis indicate. Okay, so what's the penumbra? So it's the area of situations in which it's not clear whether a given rule applies. And there, judges have some degree or kind of discretion to decide, and so they're going to decide on the basis of how they think the law ought to be understood. Okay. This is often put in terms of the idea of the rejection of formalism. If the law were, a formalist about law denies that there are areas in which it's open to interpretation, right? And a formalist judge is one who acts as though there is no room for interpretation, discretion, etc. And formalism as a way of approaching law has been subject to a lot of criticism. particularly at this time. And the idea was, look, if you reject formalism, you'll appreciate the area of interpretation, and you'll see the connection between law, how law is and how it ought to be. So this is the sense in which a rejection of formalism seems to lead to a rejection of the separation thesis. But Hart says, look, that just leads, that's just, first of all, the whole idea, right, it's based on a misunderstanding of what formalism amounts to. Okay, so the vice of formalism is often assailed, but it's rarely stated exactly what it means. Sometimes people say, well, it's the excessive use of logic in law. And the sin involved is like giving a general term an interpretation which is either blind to social values or consequences, or blind to social value or consequences. So, you just look at the letter of the law and you apply it regardless of whether in the particular case it is disastrous, right? Blind to social values. But look, Hart says logic simply doesn't dictate an interpretation. Right? Logic doesn't tell, if a term is unclear and it's not clear how it applies, logic doesn't tell you how it applies. So this doesn't involve an excessive use of logic. The mechanical judge isn't one who is too logical. The mechanical judge, the formalist judge, either pretends in some way that a case isn't penumbral when it really is, and so requires no interpretation. Right? So as when somebody, the example that gets thrown around in here is, prohibiting vehicles in the park, right? And so when a judge pretends that it's perfectly clear what a vehicle is, and of course a tricycle is a vehicle. Right? That's a matter of just ignoring the penumbra, choosing to ignore the penumbra. Or the judge might adopt, or might see that the case is in fact unclear, it's in the penumbra, and either adopt some ordinary non-legal meaning for a term, or fix on some arbitrary feature of things that clearly apply, that the term clearly applied to, and treat those arbitrary features as criteria. So, well, a tricycle has wheels, vehicles have wheels, and a tricycle has wheels, so it must be a vehicle, right? So they do something like that. And doing so without regard to social consequences, without regard to whether it actually serves the purpose, any plausible purpose that the legislation might have had in barring vehicles from the park to keep, toy trucks and tricycles out of it. Right? But what he says is, look, that's not a matter of excessive use of logic or formalism. That's a matter of making choices, interpretive choices, and they're just bad choices. That's a matter of making stupid choices, not a matter of being too logical. Moreover, Hart says, look, in fact, that's not usually what's really going on when a judge seems to apply a term formalistically, applying it to something that probably wasn't intended within the meaning of the law. Right? That wasn't really what they meant. Okay, but we're going to apply it to that anyway. So they didn't really mean tricycles, but they didn't mean, by arms, they didn't mean whatever, AK-47s, but we're going to apply it to AK-47s anyway, right? He says, often what's really going on when something is like that is done is that adopting the ordinary significance of a term furthers the policy of making the law public. Okay? So it furthers the policy of if you apply an ordinary meaning to a term, even where it doesn't seem to make sense in the context of that law, part of the reason you're doing it is because the ordinary meaning is well understood. And this will make the law, it'll make public what the law is so that, for example, legislators can rewrite the law in a way that works better, that makes clear we didn't mean that. In any event, the badness of decisions that are mechanical in this way, make bad interpretive choices, right, doesn't do anything to show that there's a problem with the separation thesis. It doesn't do anything to show that it's wrong to distinguish law as it is from law as it should be. Surely the idea is not that these decisions that are mechanically reached aren't law. Of course they are, but rather that they're bad law. And to say that just because they're bad law, they're not law, completely begs the question against the separation thesis. Okay. So to make the point, yeah.
I had a couple questions.
Yeah.
This judge that is being described, are they committed to some? If they're
No.
not as
No, presumably not. Presumably they are committed to the idea that the law as it's written is the law, and I'll just apply the law as it's written, damn the consequences.
Because I think that I may have a misconception that, like, I thought that the unifying theme of the natural law tradition, the idea that the law has a concrete, definite meaning that comes from.
Well, that's definite and concrete. I'm not sure what those mean, but well, but the main feature of the natural law tradition is that it rejects the separation thesis. Okay, it says if it isn't moral, good, as it ought to be, then it isn't law at all. The mechanical judge, as he's understood here, instead says the law is the law. It is what it says, and I will apply it as it's written, even if the result is stupid. Attacking that kind of formalism, the opponent of the separation thesis says once you realize how stupid formalism is, you'll see that there's an essential role for appeal to what the law ought to be involved in applying it in cases where that are open to interpretation, where it looks like it would make no sense to apply it as it's written, as it appears to be written. Then we've got to say, no. Tricycles, whether in the ordinary signification they're vehicles or not, it didn't mean tricycles. It doesn't. That is not part of the purpose here. That's not. It would be bad to interpret the law to do that. So the idea is that rejecting formalism brings back what looks like a central element, or it looks like it brings back a central element of natural law theory, which is that the law always needs to serve the good. Formalists say, I'm going to apply it as it's written, whether it serves the good or not. Natural law types and people who are opposed to the separation thesis say, no, you got to apply it in a way that serves the good. Yeah.
So just to clarify, law that is able, that's bad law because that would.
No, I don't think that's a fair way of putting it. Any law, almost any term, any law, there's going to be cases in which it is not clear from the ordinary meaning of the words whether it applies to that case. Okay? To interpret them, such laws mechanically, he's saying, isn't to interpret them super logically. It's to interpret them effectively without regard to the fact that it's unclear whether they apply and without regard to the fact that there may be some, to the social consequences that follow from applying them a certain way. So it's just to be, right, it's to choose, make bad choices as to how you ought to go about interpreting it, right? Just interpret it, right, as if it's not a penumbral case, or as if the purposes for which the law was enacted make no difference to how we ought to understand it. That's what a mechanical judge does. There are always going to be areas in which it's not clear whether the law applies to a particular case, whether a given law or rule applies to a particular case. It calls for judgment. Mechanical jurisprudence, as Hart is characterizing it, uses bad judgment as to how to go about thinking about whether to apply the law in that case, or how to apply the law in that case. It's not that it's bad law, it's that it's bad thinking about how to interpret law. Okay. So what the critic of the separation thesis really would have to say is that consideration of what the law ought to be is already a part of the law. They'd have to claim that the social policies that guide judges in deciding penumbral cases are already in some way part of the law. And that therefore the judge, in deciding penumbral cases as they ought to decide them, right, isn't doing anything more than drawing out what's already present in the law. That the normative considerations that a judge appeals to in deciding how to interpret a hard case, those are themselves part of the law. Okay? Now, Hart is going to reject that view. And by the way, that idea that various norms that can be appealed to in interpreting law, but that don't themselves appear in the statutes, etc., that the idea that those really are already part of the law is an idea that we're going to be dealing with for weeks. It is the central idea behind Ronald Dworkin's attack on Hart's positivism. Okay, so we're going to spend a bunch of time with that. Hart here says, look, I reject that view. I don't think those things are already part of the law. But even if they were, it simply doesn't imply that law is moral and that therefore the separation thesis is false because, and here's the central idea, the important idea, not all oughts are moral oughts. Not all norms are moral norms. And so the fact that you have to appeal to norms in the course of deciding cases, even if those norms are understood as already part of the law, doesn't mean that the resulting law will be as it morally should be. And that's what the separation thesis denies. It could satisfy a bunch of oughts, right, without satisfying the moral ought. So, for example, interpreting a law in light of its purpose will not yield a moral interpretation, will not give you the law, understand the law as it ought to be, if the purpose is not itself moral. Right? It merely means that, it would merely mean, on the hypothesis that those norms are already in the law, it would merely mean that the policy has been advanced as the purpose of the statute. The statute ought to be interpreted in light of that purpose. That doesn't mean that the purpose is a good one. However, what appealed to various norms in the course of interpreting penumbral cases does do, or might do, is make the law rational as opposed to mechanical. But that isn't guaranteed to make it moral. And what the opponent of the separation thesis needs to do is give us an argument for why the law, right, as it is as it ought morally to be. So another area that might seem to show the connection between law and morality is, for example, criminal sentencing. There's an enormous amount of discretion for judges, right, in the context of criminal sentencing. And the moral sort of color of the considerations that go into those deliberations about sentencing in criminal cases is especially clear. Okay, you might think, well, there's got to be a connection between law and morality as far as criminal sentencing goes. But no, right? Consider criminal sentencing in Nazi Germany. It might often have been guided exclusively by the desire to ensure the full effectiveness of state tyranny, or have been guided to allow the judge to avoid the wrath of the regime. And yet those sentences were law. Now, Fuller is going to argue that no, they weren't, but we'll talk about that. But I think certainly criminal sentencing could be carried out in a way that was attentive to various purposes where those purposes are immoral, but nonetheless those purposes rationalize and in some sense make the sentences what they ought to be. They ought to be in light of those purposes, but the purposes are bad. Right? I mean, think of, mandatory life sentences for 3 convictions for carrying a joint in your pocket. Okay? That was certainly the law in the United States during the heyday of the war on drugs. 3 strikes and you're out. Mandatory life sentence for 3 convictions, however minor, on drug charges. Okay, that was the law in a lot of jurisdictions. Okay, it's plainly immoral, plainly a bad idea, right? But it's not in light of the zero tolerance aims of the legislation. They had that purpose, and that supposedly the idea is that served that purpose. But if the purpose is terrible, so are the decisions that enforce the purpose. All right. Now, Hart goes on to ask whether, supposing it's true, which I think it typically is, if not almost universally, but anyway, supposing it's true, as Hart won't deny, that decisions in penumbral cases are made on the basis of policy and purpose, though not necessarily moral policy and purposes, should we simply drop the claim that there is a difference between law as it is and law as it ought to be? Not morally ought to be, but ought to be in light of the policies and purposes. That is to say, should we decide that legal rules include the aims and policies and purposes in the light of which the penumbral cases are in fact decided? That is to say, again, should we say that the law itself already includes those purposes, aims, norms in the light of which unclear cases are decided? Should we say the law isn't just the rules, it's also what Dworkin will call the principles that aid in interpreting the rules? Yeah.
There's also a claim, an epistemological claim, right, about how our ability to like determine those,
And,
like if what we should do in the context of criminal cases, look to the purposes of the law
yeah,
in making the decision application, there's a claim there that we can determine.
well, there's a claim that what we should try to do is to determine them. I don't think it has to be claimed that, that we know in all cases what they were. It just, the claim is that we should regard the purposes as part of the law, right? And therefore, when we appeal to purposes in deciding penumbral cases, what we're doing is not making law, but simply finding out what it is, what it implicitly already is. So the big picture issue here is one that I've emphasized on several occasions in the past. It's the question whether judges make law or just find law, right? And I mean, that's quite apart from the separation thesis. There's the right, people are always up in arms about judge-made law. Judges shouldn't make law. Their goal is to be neutral and just decide according to what the law is, right? Okay, so how are you, given the existence of penumbral cases where interpretive latitude means you have to, requires that you go beyond what's on the face of the law, right? Given that judges have to go beyond, how can we avoid saying that they make law? Well, by saying that what they go beyond the word of the law to is already in there, right? It's already part of the law. So that's what is being suggested here to Hart, or what Hart, a suggestion that Hart, as it were, articulates for himself, right? And he says, well, that is, right, treat that as an invitation as to how to see the law, as already containing implicitly, but really in there, the purposes, aims, norms in the light of which penumbral cases are decided. And you can't refute an invitation, but you can refuse it, right? And he says, we should refuse that invitation for two reasons. First, everything penumbral cases teach us about judicial reasoning can be expressed less mysteriously. Right? Laws are, because general rules, they are incurably incomplete. And so we decide penumbral cases by appeal to social aims. That, frankly, acknowledges the a sort of quasi-legislative role for judges. But it's not mysterious. There's nothing mysterious. If you say, well, the law, even though it doesn't say these things, already contains, right? It contains the purposes, aims, norms, principles, etc. That's mysterious. Where are they? Right? Show me. Well, you have to have a deep understanding of the interconnection between, right? Okay, yeah, that's mysterious. We can say this clearly. We can say it in a perfectly clear way and just face the reality of the fact that judges go beyond the law in deciding cases where the law is incomplete. Okay? So he says, candor favors clarity over mystery. Okay? But the second reason he gives is a little bit more subtle and a little bit more, I think, open to question. He says the utilitarian distinction between what the law is and what it ought to be preserves, while this invitation to regard the law as already containing the means to articulate what it ought to be, right? That invitation obscures the fact that the hardcore of settled cases and the core meaning of statutes, the core, right, not the penumbra, but the core, are law in some centrally important sense. That is to say that, right, when something says, you know, no motor vehicles in the park, okay, it's not supposed to be open to interpretation here whether, you know, a car counts. Of course it does. That's core. There's no room for discretion with respect to whether a car counts as a motor vehicle there. Okay? Indeed, if it says no cars allowed in the park, it is not open to discretion whether, right, whether a car counts. That's core, not penumbra. And if you were to say that the law, as it's written, already implicitly involves all the policy, it would be appropriate to ask whether, faced with the question whether a Kia Optima counts as within the proscription of cars in the park, it would be appropriate to ask whether is a Kia Optima, right? Does it serve the purposes of the law to count a Kia Optima as a car? And what Hart wants to say is, no, there's no question of that, the way there is a question of whether a tricycle counts as a vehicle. There's just no question of that. There is a core meaning there are core meanings in which there is no room for interpretation. And the claim is that to regard everything as all law as implicitly containing the purposes undercuts the distinction between the core and the penumbra, the area in which there is and is not room for the application of appeal to purposes, etc., in deciding whether a case fits under the law. Okay. He thinks you would only think that all cases are open to consideration in the light of social policy if you were inappropriately preoccupied with the penumbra. There's a reason philosophers are preoccupied with the penumbra, because that's where all the interesting cases are. But the overwhelming body of the law, he wants to say, that's not right. The overwhelming application does not involve interpretation, it's core. Now, Fuller is going to criticize Hart on this point. And the question is going to be, because I think there is good grounds in the philosophy of language for rejecting what Hart says about there being cases that are not open to interpretation. They're right about there being such a thing as a settled core, and moreover, to rejecting the idea that there couldn't be communication, effective communication, Hart seems to imply, without there being a settled core. I think there's compelling reasons in philosophy of language to think that Hart is wrong about this. But the question is going to be, does it matter to his claim? Does it matter to the claim of the separation thesis? And I think the answer is no, it doesn't actually matter to anything that he's defending, that he's explicitly defending here. But we'll get to that. Okay. I see a question in the chat that I want to respond to. Let's see the whole. Oops. Erg. Gail. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Okay, so here's the slide about, what I was just talking about. Should we include within the law itself the policies and purposes in light of which penumbral cases are decided? If so, then there's a sense in which the law itself already includes how it ought to be decided, shrinking the gap between law as it is and law as it ought to be. Right, that is that the separation thesis points to. Hart says, no, we shouldn't accept this invitation. We can just put the point less mysteriously, and it would obliterate the distinction between the core and the penumbra. Yeah.
So, for clarification, Hart's view is that, like, descriptively, we should just say that the law is incomplete and that judges just look to social consequences.
Yeah.
About the number. So
Right.
So is there something that he's concerned about the other? Oh, I'm trying to think about how to say this. There's that other ought that when there's a penumbral case, the judge should look to the purposes that are included in the law.
And to social policy, which may not be relevant to the purposes. The purposes of you could look to the legislative history to determine what the legislators were trying to accomplish or what they thought the words meant or something like that. That's right, but that itself is always, so what do you look at? You look at the Federalist Papers and you see they used a word that's unclear there too.
Yeah.
I mean, right.
But if you say that judges ought to look to that sort of stuff, what type of ought is that? Is that a moral ought or is that a game ought? That's what
I don't think he either has or needs an answer to that. It depends on whether you think that morality requires that judges not that judges not go beyond the legislative intent in deciding cases. But it's some sort, I mean, there are certainly people who think that that is an important norm. Okay, whether they think it's a moral norm, I don't know. I mean, it's somehow derived from the idea of self-government, right? That the will of the people is what legislators are supposed to enact, and that's why they are legitimate in creating law. That's their legitimacy of the legislature exerting its coercive power through force of law is supposed to depend upon the consent of the governed. Okay, you might think that that is the moral basis for the proscription on judges making law. So you might think it's real important to say the mysterious thing rather than face the bloody facts, right? Anyway, I mean, it's evidently important enough in some way that every judge who ever comes up before a Senate Judiciary Committee, right, says the job of the judge is to apply the law as written, not to make law. And then they go on and ignore that constantly in their actual, right, doings, but okay. So, another criticism of the positivist separation thesis, and I mentioned this last time, derives from the Nazi experience. So, Gustav Radbruch writes that he had considered himself a positivist, but was converted from positivism by his experience in Nazi Germany. He found people simply unable to stand up to and resist unjust German official rules, and they found them treating those rules as binding law, despite how unjust they were. And he also found people to use the fact that the rules were laws to excuse their own complicity in and perpetration of Nazi atrocities. They invoked, that is, when challenged on the horribleness of their actions, they just invoked the slogan, law is law, just doing my duty according to the law. Okay. And this engages the separation thesis right at its core. The point of the distinction between law and morality was to save morality from being swallowed up by law and to preserve the basis for the criticism of and resistance to unjust law, right? The idea was if we recognize the distinction between law and morality, we will be able to see that sometimes the law ought not to be followed. Right? Separation thesis as a way of of resisting unjust law, of grounding the possibility of criticism of law. Whereas if you think, well, law is as it ought to be, then you right, this is what the reactionary says, right? The law is, therefore, whatever the law says must be right, and I must do it. So if the actual effect of adoption of positivism with its separation thesis is that people end up committing atrocities in the name of the law, then the separation thesis will have failed in its purpose, insofar as it has a normative purpose and not just it's not just a descriptive thesis. Its normative purpose is to make room for criticism of and resistance to unjust law. Okay. But Radbruch argues that we need to put back together what the positivists took apart, right? Law and morality, precisely on the same ground that the positivists thought was crucial, on the ground that only if we do that are we able to resist unjust regimes and rules. Only then, only when we see that unjust law is not law because it's unjust, will we be able to resist unjust regimes. So they both have the same aims. The aim for both is let's resist unjust laws. Let's have a ground for criticism of unjust laws. Right? And they've got two different strategies. One says, well, right, law is not necessarily moral, and therefore we can criticize it on moral grounds. Right? And the other one says, no, law is necessarily moral, so we can criticize unjust law as not law at all. Criticize it on the ground that it isn't even valid, let alone just. Yeah.
I guess what that means. Separation thesis is not valid. It wouldn't. Text of Nazism. Separation. Like I feel like he's.
Okay, what he's doing is he's saying he's laying the blame for the Nazi experience on the adoption which the Nazis and German jurisprudence did wholeheartedly of the positivist separation thesis. He's saying it's because people no longer believe that law needs to be moral to be law that they found themselves willing and able to commit atrocities in the name of the law. What they needed to do was to realize, along with the natural law tradition, that you can't be law. It cannot be law if it's that immoral. And so going along with the law cannot be available as an excuse to commit atrocities, because it can't be law if it's that atrocious. Okay, now, right, so Radbruch argues that the doctrine of that law is law played a crucial role in the failure of the Nazi legal profession to protest against Nazi law, and that principles of humanitarian morality are part of the very concept of right or law. He says, Radbruch argues, only if we view it this way would jurists feel it legitimate to strike down and refuse to enforce rules that go against those principles. Now here, Hart is very sympathetic to the aim that Radbruch is trying to achieve, but he finds what Radbruch is saying here extraordinarily naive. He says it is just implausible that the moral insensitiveness and subservience to state power in a people like the Germans in and before World War II, right? That degree of moral insensitiveness and subservience to state power could possibly have arisen as a result of accepting legal positivism. Yeah, right. That explains Nazi Germany. In fact, that this is implausible is shown by the fact that the very same positivist doctrine is dominant in the most liberal and just societies. The claim that law is law, and whether it's moral or not, is not to be met with subservience, right? It's to be met with the question, very well, law is law, but ought it to be obeyed and enforced? Because while it is the law, it may not be moral. Right? That's what the separation thesis allows us to see. It may be the law, but that doesn't mean it's moral, and that doesn't mean that we have to obey it. There can be a conflict between law and morality, and morality can sometimes win. That's what the separation thesis says. And the separation thesis is widely believed in the most liberal and progressive societies, so it can hardly be accepting the separation thesis that explains Nazi Germany. Okay, and now we turn to a discussion of a discussion, I guess I don't have a slide for this, of the particular case that both Hart and Fuller talk about, of a woman in Nazi Germany who while her husband was away in the military during the war, turned to the attention of other men and, shall we say, fell out of love with her husband and wanted him gone. He came home for a leave, some sort of shore leave or whatever kind of leave from the military, and he said to her in private, he expressed to her in private his disdain for the regime and for Hitler, and said that he wished the assassination attempt on Hitler that failed because the person put the bomb on the wrong side of the leg of the table. He wished that had succeeded. Well, it was illegal to criticize publicly the Nazi regime, so she went to the authorities and ratted on him for having criticized Hitler. And they arrested him, and she got her way. He was gone. They were going to execute him, but I think they sent him to the Russian front or something like that, which was pretty much as good. So after the Nazi regime is over, the German law courts have to figure out what to do with cases like this. Right? And the idea was she should be prosecuted for having procured for having wrongly procured someone's arrest, wrongly procured their imprisonment. And her defense was, how could it be wrong? What he did was illegal. I was just reporting a crime. So what do? What are those courts supposed to do? Right? The woman's behavior was universally regarded, at least post-war, as horrible behavior. Right? And what the courts did, in fact, was rule that the criminal code that the husband was said to have violated by speaking against Hitler was not legitimate law. They ruled that it was not a valid law because it was immoral. And therefore, she didn't have the defense that her act of turning him in was simply reporting a crime. There was no crime she was reporting because what he did wasn't criminal because the statute which said it was not a valid law. And Hart criticizes this practice. He says that the satisfaction with the result seems to be hysterical. The goal of punishing her was laudable, but the way they secured this goal was to say that a law that was in force, or a policy that was in force for 10 years and that was duly promulgated by the German courts or the German legislature, right? To say that had never been law. And he says, look, that's simply a confusion. Right? It was law. That enforced by the courts, duly passed according to right? And you didn't like it, and I don't like it, it's immoral, but that doesn't mean it's not law. If you want to get the same result of punishing her, the right way to do it would be to introduce a frankly retrospective law making her conduct criminal, making it illegal retroactively to turn someone in for the crime of speaking out against Hitler. Right? Rather than saying it isn't a crime to speak out against Hitler, make it a crime to turn someone in for doing it. Now, that retrospective laws are odious generally. They're a bad idea, okay? Because people, basically they need to know how to conduct themselves so as to stay out of trouble, and you can't know now what a retroactive law that hasn't been passed yet how it's going to affect your conduct now. So retrospective or retroactive laws are bad news generally. But at least doing that in this case would have the benefit of candor, right? And not pretending that that this statute that was duly enforced time and time and time and time again, right, wasn't ever law. I mean, in effect, that's what was done anyway, right? It was just done in a way that covered over the fact that what they were doing was retroactively making her conduct criminal. Right? Right? They simply, by saying that statute was never law, that does is it simply covers over the fact that what we face in a case like this, what the German courts faced in dealing with this woman, was in fact a choice between two evils. Leaving her unpunished, or sacrificing a piece of morality, the idea that retrospective or retroactive legislation is bad, sacrificing that piece of morality for the sake of not leaving her unpunished. That's a choice between two bads. Two things that on the whole you'd rather not do either one. You don't want to leave her unpunished, but you don't want to pass retroactive laws. You can cover over that choice by saying, oh, it never was a law. But that's just covering over the choice you're making. Now Hart says something extraordinarily wise that you should all take with you for the rest of your lives. If we have learned anything about moral quandaries and dilemmas, it's that we should not cover them up. Face them straightforwardly. It is simply childish to assume that all of the values that we cherish will simply fit coherently into a single scheme. Fuller, when we get to him, is basically going to express what Hart here is calling a childish view of how morality works. It's all coherent, it all fits together. But the virtue of candor here on this point isn't merely formal. It's not just that it's a matter of covering up the quandary. It's also that, right, everyone understands perfectly well what the proposition, this is law, but it's uneven and unjust, means. Everyone knows what that means. Okay? In contrast, ordinary people do not understand the proposition, this is unjust, so it's not a law. Not only do they not really understand that, they're inclined to deny it. And most importantly, it seems to raise a whole pack of difficult philosophical issues, right, before you can show that it ought to be accepted. It's not an obvious truth that there are no immoral laws. Right? If that's true, then it takes a whole hell of a lot of Aquinas and defeating the counter-arguments to Aquinas to show that that's true. Okay? Whereas everyone understands what it means to say, this is a law, but it's not moral. We all have experience of them, right? Okay? And it doesn't take fancy philosophy to render that intelligible or persuasive. So what Hart says, again, another thing you should take with yourselves to the bank every day. When we have a plain mode of speech available, we should not present the moral criticism of institutions as propositions of disputable philosophy. It's so much easier to say and understand the law you just passed is an immoral law than it is to say, oh, that piece of legislation that just got signed by the president after having been introduced into both houses of Congress and passed with a majority of votes, right? It's not really a law because it's immoral. Huh? Right? That is a dubious proposition of disputable philosophy, right? The first thing is as clear as day to say. So stick with that ordinary mode of discussion. All right. But as I said, when I turn to what Fuller has to say in response to that, it will, he has things to say. So I don't know, maybe I should be doing this, putting them together with one another, but that's not how you read them, and just didn't choose to do that. Yeah.
Didn't Arendt comment on this dilemma?
I think so, and I don't remember.
I haven't read
I mean, it's been a long time since I read my Arendt. Very, very probably she did. Okay. So that's what Hart has to say about the claim that the separation thesis is false because of penumbral cases and because of its it should be treated as false because of the consequences it leads to being like Nazi Germany, right? That's what he has to say about that. But there's also this second sort of line of argument against the separation thesis, which is that it just misses various ways in which morality necessarily figures in legal systems, right? It's necessarily a feature of legal systems. So the opponent of the separation thesis, even if they agree of particular laws that they might be law but yet immoral, might say that this misses the forest for the trees, right? The system itself, in order to be a legal system, must be united to morality. And they will say correctly that any legal system has to have certain features, such as mechanisms of enforcement for sanctions, actual enforcement in the case of some breaches of rules much of the time. It has to have those, some features like that. And those, they will say, are grounded in the nature of man and connect, therefore, with morality. Okay, now, Hart first says, look, there's no point in connection with this with trying to define the term legal system by giving necessary and sufficient conditions. The search for definitional essences, necessary and sufficient conditions, is generally sterile. And he's certainly right about that. Okay? So we can't, right, come up with a definition, an adequate definition of legal systems and examine the necessary and sufficient conditions and see on that basis what connection with morality there must be. That's a waste of time. Nor should we be too quick to make inferences about essences, what's essential to a legal system from historical examples. Because though no legal system has existed that has utterly failed to respect certain moral standards, so prescriptions against murder, theft, etc., and each aims at some form of justice, right? And moreover, if that were not so, no one would have reason to obey, except for fear, right? What that means is that these are features of legal systems. These things do not mean that these are characteristics of legal systems that legal systems must necessarily have. It just means that that's what they have had. And that is not a claim about definitional necessity. But anyway, claims about definitional necessity are in philosophers' idle pastime. So, he doesn't want to trade on the idea of essences derived either by conceptual analysis or historical example, but he does want to give some more substance to the view that certain provisions are necessary to a legal system. Okay? And he does this by saying, look, there are certain natural facts about us which, though not themselves necessary facts about all possible agents, do lead to certain natural necessities about any system that could be a legal system for creatures like us. So, for example, our bodies do not change shape radically and with extreme rapidity, with such rapidity and radical as to make it impossible to identify individuals as the same through time. That's a fact about us. Okay? We are identifiable as the same individual through time. Secondly, we are not invulnerable to attack by others. If we were differently constituted and others were differently constituted, it might be, that we could perfectly well survive as monads, never interacting with others, being impervious to any attack. But we're not like that. Moreover, we have needs. We can't draw our nutrition from the air. Therefore, we need sustenance from outside, and there's a limited quantity of that, and everyone needs it. Look, if those things weren't true, we wouldn't need such things as laws to protect us from assault and theft. Right? Moreover, we also, as a matter of fact, value our own lives and living among other people. If we didn't care about that stuff, then assault and theft wouldn't be problems. They would just end up in our, dying and, or having to live infinitely far from everyone else. Not infinitely, but, distant from everyone else. But we value our lives and being among others. Okay? So legal systems that didn't have rules against murder, theft, and those things which we all take to be morally wrong would have no point at all for us. Right? So there are natural facts about us and things we universally value, as it were, that in the light of which no legal system that didn't make connection with morality on those kinds of points would have any use for us. Fair enough. So there is a connection between legal systems for human beings anyway and morality. Good. Natural law theory, however, vastly over-exaggerates the extent to which we share common and coordinatable natural aims that ensure that the law throughout, right, will have a moral content. They assume that it will have moral content far beyond the minimum required to provide for society, or for survival in proximity, given our physical natures and basic value to be in society. Okay. So yeah, right. Law is going to have to protect against murder and theft, but as to all sorts of other aspects of law, there's no reason to think that what we need and want is so uniform, right, among us that law will, that there will be there's any right that it will conform to morality. It just okay. Another way in which law must be moral is that it has to operate to a large extent according to the principle that like cases must be treated alike. Okay? It ain't a law. It isn't law if it doesn't basically have that feature. And we might say, well, that's a feature of justice, right? It's a moral requirement, right? On account of justice, that like cases be treated alike. But look, and here I think is the basic response that Hart gives, that Hart can just cite in response to pretty much everything Fuller says, but look, it says everything he says about the characteristics that law must have in order to be effective, right? Look, this fact that like cases must be treated alike just follows from the fact that laws are general rules. It's inconsistent with the idea of a general rule that it not be applied the same way in similar cases. If a thing isn't applied the same way in similar cases, it's not a rule at all. Right? So It's just implicit in the idea of a rule that it has that much morality. But of course, we're talking about law, and law is as a system of rules will have to have that feature. That's right. That doesn't go very far. You can apply terribly unjust laws the same way the same way under the same circumstances. Right? Shut up. But especially you, spam risk. Okay. So making these concessions about the basic need given our physical characteristics and values that for laws against murder and theft, etc., and given the requirement that law being made of general rules leads to conformity with justice in terms of treating like cases alike, conceding all of that, right, does not satisfy the critic of the separation thesis, because these connections of a legal system with morality can exist even in pretty thoroughly evil legal systems. I gotta stop now. We'll finish this up next time. I will have office hours from 1 to 3 tomorrow. I hope you will be there. Recording has started. Who's recording this? You're not supposed to be recording this. Wow. Somebody's been recording this. It hasn't been me.
I saw that. I thought it was you that pressed it.
No.
Sounds funny.
I certainly didn't mean to if I did.
I didn't know that,
You like ended the meeting and then like restarted it and recorded.
yeah, I didn't know
That's
that
it.
students had.
Whenever you see now recording, you let me know so I can terminate the recording. No recording.
Turn it off first.
I probably do have that power, but I don't have that knowledge.
Click on the three dots for a second.
Click on the what?
The three dots for a second.
Yeah.
That one. Yeah, so that's what you would have had to do for starting recording. Go all the way down there and then click start recording.
Yeah, I didn't do that.